These are 10 cards you should never draft in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. In fact, it would be better for you if you pretended they didn't exist in the packs when you saw them. We'll kick things off with the Silver Deputy, a card that looks like it could be mana fixing, but in reality is just losing fixing, because when you put a 2-mana 1/2 with a very minor ability into play, even if it gets you a land that you potentially want, it just puts you down a card for a just effect that just isn't worth it. Getting a 1/2 body for 2 is just so atrociously bad that this card is going to fool you into thinking it's helping you, when in reality it is sinking you. Don't put this card in your deck. Next is Ferocification, a card that is atrocious. I'm trying to come up with a pun here, but I haven't had time to come up with a pun because I have seen this card so little in this draft format. I've never been tempted to put it into play. My opponents hopefully have never been tempted to put it into play. It is so rarely going to be worth playing that you should just pretend it doesn't exist. Ignore the fact that it's an uncommon. Just don't play this card. It's absolutely terrible. Giving yourself a minor stats boost only on your turn is just really not useful. Giving something menace and haste. What if you have to block? What if you have no creatures? What if you don't have good attacks? These are the sorts of things Ferocification doesn't help with, and it just loses you the game when you put it into play a lot of the time. Next is Neutralize the Guards, the sort of card that could theoretically potentially be a sideboard card that you would want to have against certain matchups, but the matchup just doesn't come up. There's not enough 1/1s running around. This card is just not worth playing. Maybe you sideboard it, but even then you don't want to draft it. You want to get this card last pick and be like, okay, maybe in these 1 out of 1,000 scenario, I'll bring this in out of the sideboard. But generally, this is the sort of card that if you main deck this card, you're going to be unhappy with it. There's not enough use for it. There's not enough 1 toughness things that are actually going to be able to get knocked off by this one, and it's too inefficient to be a good combat trick. Next is Slickshot Vaultbuster, the classic 3-mana 1/4 vigilance creature that for some reason has an ability that helps it attack. I mean, I guess you could commit crimes on your opponent's turn to get a reasonable 3-powered blocker, but other than that, this card just absolutely does nothing. You get this card last pick, and so you'll have it in your card pool and be like, oh, I have this card that I could play. But just because you have it in your card pool doesn't mean it was anything better than the last pick that you had it as. Don't put this card in your deck. I don't think I've literally seen anybody cast this card. I've never wanted to cast this card, and you shouldn't either. Next is Tomb Trawler, the card that screams, I have a dream to put the cards from my graveyard on the bottom of my library so that I can draw my deck and only draw my good spells. But that dream is actually a nightmare because you put this card in your deck and you realize it as soon as you draw it that this card does nothing. So don't put this card in your deck and don't try to live that dream. You can draft sweet graveyard decks, but this is not the sort of thing that's going to help you enable those cool synergies. Next is Bovine Intervention, a card that in Commander maybe would have some use, where you kill something, they get a 2/2, it doesn't matter. But in Limited, a 2/2 certainly matters, because oftentimes you're killing something that's only slightly better than a 2/2 anyway. One time, the only time actually I've seen this card, my opponent killed my 2/2 to give me a 2/2. Sure, it had an ability, but the ability was certainly not as relevant as the stat line, and a 2/2 is a real creature. Giving your opponent this sort of advantage is going to lose you games. Don't play Bovine Intervention. Next is Overzealous Muscle, maybe the winner of the most playable of these least playable cards. This is still a card you should never draft. Maybe you'll get a couple last pick, but it's the sort of thing where in Modern Era Limited, putting a random 5/4 for 5 in your deck that has very, very minor abilities, it only gains indestructible on your turn, which is just like a nail in the coffin for this sort of card, where it's just so inflexible. When you're playing an aggro deck, you don't even really want a random 5-drop that you just play a 5-drop, your opponent untaps, kills it for 3 mana, kills it for 2 mana, does any number of things, and you're just left there looking at your Overzealous Muscle in your graveyard, wondering what happened and why you're about to lose. And it's because you played this card, so don't play this card, even though the flavor text is hilarious. Not everyone can be a pickpocket. I literally never seen the flavor text because I've never seen that card in play. Next is Sheriff of Safe Passage, the classic 3-drop that has potential upside that looks great, but is so bad on the downside that it's just going to lose you the game, and so is therefore not worth playing. Just stick to old reliable 3-drops, 3-mana 3/3s, which you get all the time these days, and don't worry about trying to play a 3/3 that can sometimes be a 4/4 or sometimes like something like that. You don't need to worry about those sorts of things. Just avoid this card because, I mean, it's like you plot it, and then sometimes you get a 2/2 out of the deal or a 3/3, or it's just so unreliable. If this is your only creature, or you top deck it in the late game when you really need something to impact the board, you're going to be embarrassed and sad and lose the game because of this card, and you don't want your creatures to ever just lose you the game because of how bad they are on the downside, which this card does. Next is Brimstone Roundup, a card that should be rounded down in your estimations, if anything. I came up with that off the top of the dome. I don't have time to come up with puns for these cards because I've seen them so infrequently in play. I've seen them in the draft, of course, and then I just quickly pass them and pretend they don't exist in the packs because I think that's what everyone should do with these sorts of cards. When you cast your second spell, you get a 1/1. Sure, sounds good. If you do this 2 times, you get 2 1/1s, which already... That's the sort of thing that you normally pay 2 mana and get 2 1/1s right away. You don't have to like buy it on the installment plan. And sometimes maybe in the insane situation, you'll get 3 1/1s, but by that point, the game has developed to a point where the 1/1s don't do anything. And you really don't want Brimstone Roundup in your deck. A lot of the times, you'll be like, oh man, I can't double spell anymore because I have no spells left in my hand. And you have Brimstone Roundup just sitting there doing nothing. The only time I've actually seen this card and had the option to play it was when I stole it from my opponent with a Siphon Insight, because the only other option was a land, and I feel like I probably should have taken the land because of how useless this card was. Finally, we have Shifting Grift, and the only person getting grifted by this card is you, because exchanging control of 2 target creatures, while good in theory, is oftentimes just going to be a disaster where you're like, okay, I need to set this up where I have like a 1/1 and they have something really good, and then you end up in a situation where you give them like a 1/1 and you get like a 3/3 because that's the best you could muster. And like, while there are going to be highlight reels with this card, there's also going to be so many games where you draw it and you're like, well, this card does absolutely nothing, and in those games you're going to lose because you drew Grift. And because of that, huge, tremendous downside in so many situations. Don't put shifting. I haven't even got practice saying this card because it comes up so rarely. Literally never seen this get cast with or against me, and I've been drafting this format a ton, and I understand why it's not getting cast, because this is the sort of card that you don't want to put in your deck. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you avoid these cards, and I'll talk to you next time.